Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Megan Doherty, the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather this evening, we're all on indigenous lands. As you join us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the indigenous presence in your area. And I'll put in the chat, once I'm done talking, I'll put in the chat a link to a resource to help you find out more information about the indigenous presence, both past and present in your area. And as I sit in my house on the banks of the Pemigewasset, I'm on Indakina, the ancestral and present homelands of the Abnaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. I'm grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways, and I seek ways to personally and professionally learn more. For our second Mountain Voices lecture this academic year, we're joined by Peter Groffman. He's a professor at the City University of New York Advanced Science Research Center and the Earth and Environmental Sciences program at the Graduate Center and Brooklyn College Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. He's also a senior research fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. His research focuses on climate effects on ecosystem biogeochemical processes related to carbon and nitrogen cycles. Much of his research is based at the Hubbard Brook Long-Term Ecological Research Site here in Woodstock or Thornton, depending where you draw the line, where he's worked since 1992. And he will be speaking with us about this research tonight. Please join me in welcoming Peter. We can all have our clapping emojis.
I'm just delighted to be here. We're all of us at Hubbard Brook are actually quite excited that we're having this seminar series so that people can get a little more familiar with the work that goes on at Hubbard Brook, which is a well-known research site. We've done a lot of research there for a long period of time. But we realize that many people in the area are not super familiar with what goes on at Hubbard Brook. And so we're really happy to have this opportunity to share some of our experiences through this seminar series. And so I'm going to start. I'm going to let me see if I'm sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen? Let's see.
Not yet.
Yeah, so that's right. I didn't share it yet. There we go. Okay. And okay. So I'm going to talk about the Hubbard Brook ecosystem study, which is a long-term ecological study. And I just wanted to start off with I consider myself to be the most lucky scientist on the planet because I get to work at Hubbard Brook. It's really as I'm going to try and convince you, it's a really there's a lot of really good science that goes on there, but it's also just a really fun place to do science. And you can see here's a picture of some of the researchers from Hubbard, some of the founding members of the Hubbard Brook ecosystem study on the porch at Pleasant View Farm, which is on Mirror Lake Road there in Thornton. This picture was taken, I think, 65, 66, 67, sometime like that. And it's just a fun place to do science. And then here's a picture from our annual cooperators meeting last summer, which was taken on the campus of a very distinguished educational institution nearby. Who can identify where this picture is taken? Anybody recognize where this picture is?
I know.
So it's on the quad at Plymouth State. We had our meeting at Plymouth State. We were very lucky to be able to have the meeting there. But you look at that picture and you see you've got 200 people. We have young people, we have old people, we have a whole bunch of people coming together to share research results and to have a good time. And it's just so I consider myself to be the world's luckiest scientist because I get to work at Hubbard Brook. And so what am I going to cover today? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work at Hubbard Brook, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the science, right? So this is a forest up the road. We learn a lot about the forests in New Hampshire, but we also learn things that are relevant to forests across the world. And so research presentations, can be a little dry and a little sleepy. But the work at Hubbard Brook, there's a couple of things about it that make it really fun to talk about, I think. So one is it's long-term research. And again, everything at Hubbard Brook starts in the late 50s and the early 60s, and so it's unique that it's long-term research. And the thing that's amazing about the long-term research is we keep getting surprised. We keep getting these surprising results. So we make these measurements for 50 or 60 years. We think we have an understanding of the system, And then there's all these surprising results, and then they raise new questions, and we have to design new studies. We have to continue the long-term studies, and so the story of Hubbard Brook is definitely a story of long-term research that's driven by the emergence of surprising results that require further long-term studies to address. We like to think about it that we do this work, and we publish these papers in scientific journals, but the organisms that we study, the trees, the soils, the salamanders, they do not read the scientific literature, and they do not do what they're supposed to do by what we tell them in the scientific literature, and so we always get these surprises. So that's a theme of presenting the science. And then the other theme is the work at Hubbard Brook has broader impacts, is the term that we like to say, at the interface between science and society. And it has been a focus since the very beginning on producing research that is useful to a wide range of stakeholders that are trying to manage the forest, that are trying to protect the forest, that are trying to benefit the forest. And so all the research that we do has some sense of purpose to be useful to society. And then also the broader impacts is we're also trying to improve the culture of science. And so you heard Megan's wonderful land acknowledgement to begin the talk. And I think in many areas of science, we're trying to recognize the cultural context for our work. We're trying to diversify the workforce that we have. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of our efforts at the interface between science and society as well. So those are the three things I'm going to cover. But a little bit of introduction. And so the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest was established in 1955 by the USDA Forest Service, and mostly for hydrologic research. And if you think about it, forests do many things for us. We like to use the term ecosystem services. But the big thing that forests do is they provide water. You have a nice forested area, and those forests, they collect the rainfall and they deliver it to rivers and streams and reservoirs. And the USDA Forest Service manages vast areas of forest, and one of the big purposes of that is for water and to manage reservoirs, which is a complex task. The Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Study was a study that was initiated in 1963 and was much more of a basic science study. So this was a collaboration between university researchers at Dartmouth and Yale and Cornell. And they were developed, and I'll describe, there was an academic approach to develop this small watershed approach to study these ecosystems, and I'll describe what the watershed approach is. And then we're also part of a network. Starting in 1987, there was the National Science Foundation recognized that a lot of the questions that we're addressing in ecosystem science, especially in forests, which the organisms are long-lived, require long-term research. And so we're very lucky to be a part of this long-term ecological research network. It's a network of sites across the country that is doing long-term sites. And here's a picture of this long-term ecological research network. So this is a network of about 30 sites that are distributed mostly in the continental U.S., but there's a site in Puerto Rico. There are sites in Alaska. There's a site in the tropical coral reef. But you can see there's a bunch of sites in the north and east. So there's Hubbard Brook over here. There's the Harvard Forest, which is in Petersham, Mass. There's the Plum Island ecosystem, which is in the north shore of Massachusetts. And it's a wide range of sites. So there's a bunch of forested sites, but there are prairie sites, there are desert sites, there are these Arctic sites. And it's just a centerpiece for ecosystem research in the United States. Many people making long-term observations and sharing information amongst the sites. And we're very lucky at Hubbard Brook to be a part of that, because it just provides a whole continental context for the work that we do. We're also part of a network of Forest Service research stations. So the Forest Service has the awesome responsibility of managing the forests of the United States for multiple reasons. Again, we talked about water, but also the provision of wood and the provision of wildlife and biodiversity. And so Hubbard Brook is part of the Northern Research Station, which is this network of sites across the country. And again, this adds huge context for our research, and that it happens, I think, to many of us in many ways. But in our research, sometimes we feel like we're working in our own little corner. But because if we're part of this long-term ecological research network, and if we're part of this Northern Research Station, it gives a much broader context for our work and makes the work better and more useful. One more organizational detail that I'll promise I'll stop. So the Hubbard Brook ecosystem study is this rather sprawling collaboration. The forest, the experimental forest, is managed by the Forest Service. We also have government collaborators from the U.S. Geological Survey. And then we just got a huge group of universities, right? So the original group, it was Cornell and Dartmouth and Yale. We have a huge group now from the University of New Hampshire and from Boston University. We have some nonprofits. So there's the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, which does education and outreach work at the site. I'm associated with the Carey Institute, the Smithsonian. There's I go back to that picture with the 200 people standing over on the campus at Plymouth State. These people are from lots of different institutions, lots of different kinds of institutions, lots of institutions in different places. And that adds to the intellectual and kind of practical richness of the site, makes it kind of a fun place to be there. Okay, so there's enough organizational stuff for you. And so this is a map of the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. You can see it's in West Thornton. Of course, I've never been able to really tell the difference between West Thornton and Thornton. Neither of them are really huge municipal areas, but it's about 2,000 acres of site. You can see this is a watershed map. It's drained by the main Hubbard Brook over here, which goes, and then you can see there's Highway 93. And the centerpiece of this, I'm going to talk a lot about it, is a series of small experimental watersheds up in this corner of the watershed. There are 6 over here, and then there are 3 more experimental watersheds on this north-facing slope over here. So that's a map of our site. And again, the big science advance was the idea that we could use watersheds as our unit of study. Now, in many areas of science, you have a study organism, right? So in biomedical science, we use mice as a study organism. We learn lots about human physiology and human metabolism from studying mice. And in genetics, they have fruit flies. They learn a lot about genetics from studying fruit flies. And in environmental science, environmental science is relatively recent. Really got started. Ecosystem science really got started in the 60s and the 70s with concerns about bald eagles and biomagnification and eutrophication of lakes. And a huge advance for us was to develop our own kind of study organism. And so here's a picture of the study watersheds at Hubbard Brook, and you can see this picture was taken in 85, I think, but you can still see, if you're driving up 93, you can still see, you have a view of this slope where you can see these watersheds, and they look different now, but you can still see that there's different kind of this funny patchwork of cutting on the hill slope. It's harder to see now since they raised the speed limit. When it was 55, you could really get a good look at these watersheds as you were going up. But the scientific advance of the watershed concept was a pretty intact system that we could study, right? So we want to study forests, and it's trees and it's soil and it's water and it's organisms, and so we needed a relatively big unit of land that we could use to study. And the watershed is defined by the area of land that drains to a certain point. So you can see there's a stream here. And this is a topographic divide so that all the water that falls within this area moves to this stream and then drains to this point. And you're looking at, so here's another watershed that's just been clear cut, and that's down over here. Here's a watershed that was cut, and they left a riparian strip. This is a reference watershed, so it's hard to see the boundary. Here's another watershed that was treated with a clear cut experiment, and you can see it drains there. These watersheds were like the experimental rats or the experimental mice that were used in other disciplines. And it was a huge advance for us. And here's a side view of how this watershed approach works. So you can see here's the topographic divide, and all the rainfall that falls within this area is either going to drain to this stream point, or it's going to go back to the atmosphere as evapotranspiration. And the watersheds at Hubbard Brook, we have a very tight bedrock, so that that the water is not leaching into the deep rocks, which would complicate our tracing where the water goes. But with these watersheds, you have a bunch of these precipitation collectors. So I measure how much water comes in from the atmosphere. and I measure how much water leaves in the stream using these weirs over here. And then by subtraction, I can calculate evapotranspiration. And this then really enables us to use these as a unit of study. We measure the chemistry of the water coming in, and we measure the chemistry of the water coming out. And you can see this is in the early days. You can see very sophisticated instrumentation that we established at the site to collect the water coming in, to measure the amount of water, and the chemistry. You can see we measure the amount of water. And then here are these weirs down at the bottom, where you build this at the bottom of the stream, and you collect the amount of water in a control section, and so you can measure the water coming out. So thinking about watersheds was a huge advance in ecosystem science that really got started at Hubbard Brook. And there was the whole idea that we could learn about these ecosystems by measuring the quantity and the quality of the water coming out of these watersheds. It was very much like urinalysis. So we go to a physician, and the physician samples the urine and measures the chemistry of the urine, and then infers something about the functioning of the patient. That's us. And so we sample the water, we measure the chemistry, and it tells us something about the function of the ecosystem. And it's very useful for disturbance and response studies. So as you can see from those pictures, there was a series of cutting experiments. We've also done chemical addition experiments. We've done biological manipulations. But you apply the disturbance and analyze the response. Just like a physician will, a patient is disturbed with disease, that will show up in the chemistry of the urine. And so this the development of the watershed approach is the initial reason why Hubbard Brook became a very famous place, because it would develop this tool that we could use to study ecosystems all around the world. And what's great is that when you apply the disturbance and analyze response, you then pose hypotheses. You say, why? Well, what caused that response? And so you pose hypothesis about how the system is functioning internally, again, just like a physician with a patient, and it drives the science forward by posing questions that you then follow up and study with research. It's as a tool for driving question and question formation. It's a wonderful tool. It's also very useful for analyzing long-term response to subtle changes. Forests are complex ecosystems with long-lived organisms. They change very slowly and in complex ways. And so the watershed approach, where we're analyzing the drainage water quantity and quality, if we do that over 50, 60 years, we can really see how these forests are maturing, or how they're being disturbed, or how they're responding to environmental change. And so the watershed approach has been very useful for us at Hubbard Brook. And again, here's our watersheds. Here's how these watersheds work. And one of the first observations, and so this was in the early days, they said, well, all right, let's see what's in the rainfall. And they put this plastic funnel out there, and they started measuring the rainfall. And then they're measuring the pH of the rainfall, and they realized, boy, the pH of the rainfall is really low. This is in the 60s. And no one was thinking about acid rain in the United States. They've been thinking about it in Europe for a while. And so they kind of scratched their heads, and they said, well, maybe we have an acid rain problem in North America. And they said, no, that seems unlikely. And the problem in Europe was they had realized that there were all these coal-fired power plants in Great Britain that were emitting sulfur into the atmosphere, and the sulfur was drifting over to Scandinavia, and all these lakes became acidified and dead in Scandinavia. And then at Hubbard Brook, they then discovered that the same thing was happening in North America, that coal-fired power plants in Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania, and the air blows from the west and the south, and was transporting the sulfur to Hubbard Brook. And so we had an acid rain problem at Hubbard Brook. And again, it was the watershed approach facilitated that kind of discovery. And again, you can see here this is the old-fashioned instrumentation. This is the old-fashioned weirs here. And we now have very carefully, because we're trying to maintain the integrity of the long-term record, all these equipment has been upgraded, but lots of comparison to make sure that the change in equipment doesn't change the nature of the results that we get. So that's the watershed approach. And that kind of, it underlies a lot of the work that we do at Hubbard Brook. And the other thing that underlies our work, or kind of guides our work, is a conceptual model. How do we think about the forest. And conceptual models are useful for everyone. But if you think for a second, okay, I'm studying forests in New Hampshire, how would I think about that? The way we do it at Hubbard Brook is we'd like to think that there are three drivers of change in the forests at Hubbard Brook and elsewhere through New England, right? We have changing atmospheric chemistry, which in particular for us has been changes in acid rain, but also increases in the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. We have a changing climate, as we all see, and we have changing biota. We have some species are dying, some species are colonizing, we have exotic species coming in. And so these are the three drivers of change, but the drivers of change have a complex interaction with the forest. And from the simplest point of view, if you think about a forest that acid rain falls on a forest, it has a much different effect if it falls at the top of the hill where the soils are thin than if it does at the bottom of the hill. And it's the same with the changing biota is capable of invading in certain places and not others. The climate change plays out across the landscape very differently. So we like to think of our forest as a geophysical and historical template. And these disturbances or these drivers play out on the template, different soils, different topography, different organisms. And the interaction between the drivers and the template is what produces the responses. We follow four main kinds of responses. We track the vegetation, what species are there, which ones are growing well, which ones are not growing well. We track the food web, which is the insects and the birds, the salamanders, and other species. A lot of tracking of the hydrology, the water, which is the original Forest Service mandate. And then biogeochemistry, which is the interactions between the biological processes, the geological processes, and the chemical processes that are all mixed in together with vegetation, animals, and the hydrology. So this is our conceptual model, and I think it's useful. I think it's useful to think about, just to step back and say, okay, yeah, if I'm thinking about forests in the Northeast, this is what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about how the atmosphere is changing, how the climate's changing, how the biota is changing, how those are playing out in different parts of the forest, and how they're producing responses. And so I was going to summarize some of our science, and I was going to talk about changing a little bit of our results on changing atmospheric chemistry, a little bit on changing climate, and then a little bit on the changing biota. So let's talk first about changing atmospheric chemistry or changing air pollution. This is a good news story. So I don't know if you've noticed this, but the air is just a whole lot cleaner than it was 50 years ago. So this top graph here shows sulfate, sulfur in the rainfall. So you can see this is bulk deposition, which is just the water that falls out of the sky. And so in 1960, there's a lot of sulfur in the rain. And again, this is acid rain. It was coming from the Midwest. Sulfur was coming from the Midwest, and largely due to the research at Hubbard Brook, they passed the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, and the amount of sulfur has dropped it's dropped almost to zero. It has dropped incredibly by about 95%, the amount of sulfur. And this was an amazing accomplishment in environmental science, in that Hubbard Brook scientists were able to say, hey, we have a problem. There's sulfur in this rain. You can see down here is pH over here. The pH of the rainfall was 4. Many of us thought maybe that's why our hair was thinning, because the rain was falling on our head and dissolving our hair. But probably that's not the case. And they went to the public and they said, we've got a problem here in the Northeast of North America, and we're going to have to do something to get the sulfur out of the coal, out of the fuel that we burn. And of course, as you can imagine, when this was presented to the power companies and to the coal companies, they responded, oh yes, this is a problem. We'll get right on that and get it out of and clean up the air. And of course, that's not the case. And it was a huge battle, but it's a great success because our environmental scientists, they identified a problem. They proposed a solution, which was to remove the sulfur from the coal. The solution was implemented. And then over time, since we have long-term research, we're able to track the fact that the amount of sulfur in the rain has gone down like crazy. And the pH has gone up from 4 to 5. And if you remember from chemistry, the pH unit is a logarithmic scale. So pH rainfall that's pH 4 is 10 times more acidic than pH 5. And so there's really been this huge increase. You can see it started off slow, and then has accelerated in recent years, and it's a great success story, and one that's pretty clear scientifically. There's another story in here that's a little more puzzling, and this second line here is nitrate, form of nitrate in the rainfall. And you can see in the 60s and the 70s, and into the 80s and into the 90s, there was quite a bit of nitrogen in the rainfall, which was also coming from the combustion of fossil fuels. And that started to decline long about the mid 90s and into the 2000s. And that's also declined also because of legislation. But there's been some surprises there, right? So this is the chemistry of the precipitation. This is the precipitation of the rainfall coming in. It has a lot of sulfur, has a lot of nitrogen. It's less acidic. So remember, in the watershed approach, we look at the water that comes in, and then we also look at the water that comes out. So this is the chemistry of the streams at Hubbard Brook. So I'm draining, this is like the urinalysis example that we gave. And you can see, here's the sulfur in the stream. In the 60s, it was very high, and it has dropped, and it's dropped by about 95% over time. And so this is the whole watershed approach. The inputs change, and then the outputs change. A little bit of a puzzle, and a real surprise. And you can see this down here is this graph is acid neutralizing capacity, which means that the streams are much less acidic, much more hospitable for fish, salamanders, and other organizations. But the surprising result for us has been this nitrogen graph over here, which you can see was pretty high in the 60s and the 70s. And then it really started to drop, like in the 80s. It dropped to almost nothing. And you can see this is the 80s over here. And in the 90s, it dropped further, and it's continued to drop. Now, the sulfur has dropped very much in sync with the drop in sulfur in the rainfall. It took the sulfur out of the coal. You end up with less sulfur emitted to the atmosphere. You end up with less sulfur in the rainfall, and it's a kind of a one-to-one relationship. With nitrogen, there's been some declines in the nitrogen from the atmosphere, but this decline in nitrogen started in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And you can see this is the decline in nitrogen. You can see was quite high in the 80s and didn't start to drop until the middle of the 90s. So there's a nitrogen mystery at Hubbard Brook, as that why are the streams have less nitrogen? And this is really an interesting mixture because these have, in many cases, our chemical methods cannot detect any nitrogen in the stream. And there's some idea that the streams actually they're more dilute or cleaner than they were in pre-industrial times. And so there's been some change in the system that's caused a surprising change in the chemistry. And just to give a little bit of an introduction to this, I'll try not to talk too much about this, but nitrogen is a big focus of our research because it's what limits the growth of plants. There's not a lot of nitrogen in rocks, and for the most part, the rocks at Hubbard Brook have no nitrogen. So calcium and phosphorus and potassium and all these other nutrients are present in rocks, and the rocks lead to the formation of soil, and so the plants can get their nutrients. But there's no nitrogen in the rocks. All the nitrogen on the planet is in the air, and it's really hard to get it out of the air. And this is what limited human population growth for millions of years, and that people's ability to grow food depended on their ability to get nitrogen from manure, or they used to mine bird guano in Chile and bring it up and use that as fertilizer. In the 1900s, humans figured out how to take nitrogen out of the air by making fertilizer and fertilizer plants where you take air and you heat it up to high temperature and pressure, use a lot of catalyst, and this creates fertilizer. And this was a huge advance in that it facilitated fantastic increases in crop production and human population, but we use nitrogen inefficiently. Fertilizer is cheap. We use it inefficiently, and so it leaks out all over the place. And so there's this widespread pollution of water and air from nitrogen, and there's this concern about nitrogen saturation of native ecosystems. So in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot of concern about nitrogen saturation of the forests at Hubbard Brook. They were getting too much nitrogen. It was going to alter the chemistry. It was going to cause different organisms to grow. And again, if you go back to the human medical example, there are lots of things we talk about chemical changes in our bodies that cause a variety of balance problems. And that was the concern with nitrogen. But now our data, and we've been concerned about this nitrogen saturation problem at Hubbard Brook for a long time, but now we've got a new problem in that the nitrogen seems to have disappeared, and we seem to have gone from nitrogen surplus that we had back in the, I'm going to get a fancy pointer. This nitrogen surplus problem that we had in the 70s and the 80s, so now we have a nitrogen shortage, or what we call nitrogen oligotrophication. This is something that's really emerged from the work at Hubbard Brook. And this idea of nitrogen shortages or nitrogen oligotrophication, how can this be? And it's a real interesting surprise and challenge for us because we've spent some time thinking about how could this be. So conceptually, we think that our system has changed, that the world is warmer and it's wetter and it's greener, and there's all this extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And all these things conspire to increase biological demand for nitrogen. The trees want more nitrogen, and the soil organisms want more nitrogen. And so this demand for nitrogen has gone up, and that has led to a shortage, and that there's just not enough supply to meet that demand. And so now we have a system of nitrogen shortages or nitrogen oligotrophication. And so this is the real advantage of having long-term data like we do at Hubbard Brook. So you can make an observation, you can say, gee, that's a surprise. But then we get an idea. So we pose a hypothesis. We think that this is being driven by multiple components of global change. So then we go out and look for it. So can we find empirical evidence for these symptoms of nitrogen oligotrophication? We find it at Hubbard Brook. Can we find it at other sites across the world? And we can then say, well, okay, is this an important change? And the real, if the forests are short on nitrogen, it has lots of implications for, it means the forests aren't going to grow as fast. It means they're not going to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as well as we would like. It means they're not going to support biodiversity. So leaves have nitrogen in them, and the insects eat the leaves, and the birds eat the insects. And so if the leaves have less nitrogen, the insects make less protein, the insects don't grow as well, and then the birds don't grow as well. So there are these implications of up the food chain for biodiversity support. And so there's a whole bunch of science in terms of, and this is just a classic Hubbard Brook question where we make a surprising observation, we pose a hypothesis, we then go out and test that hypothesis with empirical evidence. There's also this challenge of communication. And so we worry, and I'll talk a little bit about this, about this is a complex story. We've been telling people that there's too much nitrogen for 30 years, and now are we going to change our story and tell them that, oh, now we have a nitrogen shortage? Is this going to confuse our stakeholders? Is this going to, we've been bothering farmers and power plant operators for decades to use less nitrogen, and are they now going to say that, oh, we're changing your story, now we're not going to listen to you anymore? So there's a science communication issue there. I'll try and run through this quickly. So one of the things, this is just part of the nature of the science. So we went out to look for this evidence causes and consequences of this declining nitrogen availability. And we did it, this was an effort where we said, okay, what do we see at Hubbard Brook, and do we see the same thing in other places? And so we have a series of graphs. So we have this nitrogen in the rainfall. You can see this is data from Europe. At Hubbard Brook, we've seen since the 90s, the nitrogen has gone down. It was very low in the 20s, it's gone up. It's still quite high, but they see the same thing in Europe, where they went from this nitrogen surplus to much lower levels of input. We look at the nitrogen in the stream, right? So at Hubbard Brook, the nitrogen in the stream was high in the 80s, and it's dropped into the 90s, and it's continued to drop. This is not Hubbard Brook. This is another site in Western Virginia, where again, we see something at Hubbard Brook, and we want to know, is it a local effect, or is it a regional or a continental effect? So we go to look at other streams, and we can see they're seeing the same thing in the stream over there. We're very much interested in the nitrogen content of the leaves, or what we call foliar N. And again, we see it at Hubbard Brook, that there's less nitrogen in the leaves, and which means that they're worse food for insects and worse food for birds. And again, we see the same thing in these European forests. The nitrogen content of the leaves has gone down. We see the same thing we see in Hubbard Brook. Here's some of our data from Hubbard Brook. We've been looking at nitrogen supply in the soil. This is just the ability of the soil to supply nitrogen to plants. We've been measuring this since the 90s at Hubbard Brook, and it has been going down, and it's an alarming symptom of this nitrogen shortage. We also measure nitrogen gases coming out from the soil. At Hubbard Brook, we have a very long-term record of that. We measure this gas nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, and the emissions of this gas have just disappeared pretty much since the late 90s. Another symptom of nitrogen shortage at Hubbard Brook. We look at the tree rings, so you can sample these tree rings. You can measure the nitrogen content of the tree rings, and that allows you to go back. And so this, you can see, look at the N15, the nitrogen content of these tree rings. So you get an old tree, and you can see that the nitrogen shortage started around 1920, and is really where it began to decline, which is just about the time that climate change was really starting to take hold. It was when the world was beginning to get warmer and wetter and greener with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we see it in the tree rings. And again, the concern with this nitrogen is this reduction in forage quality. So you see, here's trees, and when they have less nitrogen, they're not as green. The insects don't do as well, and then the birds don't do as well. And we're very concerned about the long-term change in birds. Across the world, they're concerned about this in native rangelands. So you have many indigenous peoples that are nomadic pastoral societies that rely on grasses, and if the grasses have less nitrogen, they don't grow as well, and the grazers don't do as well. And so it's these pastoral societies, but then also like you go to the Serengeti, and we have lots of charismatic megafauna that are going to be affected by this. So this nitrogen story is a surprising story for us, and again, it's just a classic Hubbard Brook story where we see a surprising result, we pose some hypotheses, we test the hypotheses, we then do comparative studies with people around the world, and then we produce some recommendations for society. So we're going to have this is a real problem for society, which is going to have lots of implications. The challenge for us is figuring out how to communicate this message. And this is something, it's very fun to be at a science museum to talk about this, because science museums play this incredibly vital role in society and working the interface between science and society. And scientists, we like to think that there are two kinds of science communicators. They're the really horrible ones who just drone on and using unintelligible jargon. And then you have the terrible ones who are just kind of everyone else who's just kind of lousy at it. And as we work with science museums and science communicators, we move from the horrible category to the terrible category. And we worry about this a lot. And we've always felt that, okay, maybe in environmental science, we're not great communicators, but at least we're better than the nutrition people. And like in other areas of science, they have a lot of trouble communicating. And the nutrition is an example of, like, are eggs good for you? Is butter good for you? For a while, that no, you shouldn't eat those. No, those things are good to eat. And when we change our story, when we have confusing and contradictory methods, we really worry that our stakeholders are going to lose faith in science and in scientists, and then it's going to reduce their willingness to take steps to address nitrogen pollution problems or to improve their health. And so this question of, we have very interesting science results about nitrogen, but this business of how do we communicate that is just as important to us as learning the science. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about nitrogen. I'm going to try. I'll go quickly. So I have my conceptual model where I have changing atmospheric chemistry that's produced a nitrogen surprise. We've also had some surprising changes in climate and some surprising changes in biota. Let me say a little bit about the changes in the climate. The big surprise of the climate is that climate change has been much more dramatic in the winter than it has been in the summer. And so, yes, it's warmer in the summer than it was, and it rains more, but the temperature increase has been much more dramatic in the winter than in the summer. And then all kinds of weird stuff has been happening in the winter. So we have these declines in snowpack. We end up with these snow droughts. We have ice storms. And so a lot of our work at Hubbard Brook has been focused on changing in the winter. And I know we had a question early about, do we measure the temperature at Hubbard Brook, and do we compare with Mount Washington? And here's that comparison. So here's the long-term temperature record. So it's going back to 1940 for Pinkham Notch. And then here's Hubbard Brook. And then here's Mount Washington. And as you would suspect, boy, it's colder at the top of Mount Washington than it is at Hubbard Brook. But it's really useful to have multiple sites that are measuring the temperature. it's going up at the top of Mount Washington, it's going up at Pinkham Notch, it's going up at Hubbard Brook. But you know that your site's not weird. Another huge surprise that we've had in the climate at Hubbard Brook has been an increase in evapotranspiration. And this is the amount of water that the forest is pulling out of the soil and sending back to the atmosphere. It's a very important term in the water budget. And so you look at this evapotranspiration, which we've been measuring since the 60s, it goes along, goes up, it goes down with the climate. And then long about 2005, it just takes off. And this is a huge surprise that we don't really understand what's causing that. And I think later in the term, you're going to hear from Eric Kelsey, a professor at Plymouth State, who's done a lot of this work. And so that'll be an interesting talk. But again, just a huge surprise and how we're going to figure that out. I'm going to skip some of this. I'll skip some of that. Other surprising aspects of climate change have been the loss of cold temperatures. This is a little bit of a complex graph, but it says, it looks at like minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 20. And then here are the hot temperatures, like 25, positive 25 and positive 20. And what you can see over the last 50 years or so, the really cold temperatures have disappeared. There's been an almost 50% decline in days when it gets to minus 25 or days when it gets to minus 20. There's been a small increase in really hot days, but the real surprise is that the climate's been changing at the bottom end. We've lost those really cold days. Now, if you have an old furnace, this is great, right? Because when it's minus 25, you really worry about the furnace breaking on those cold days. But it has a big effect on the distribution of organisms, which is the next thing I'll talk about. In particular, invasive pests like the hemlock woolly adelgid, ticks, tiger mosquito, a bunch of pests are moving into New Hampshire and other parts of the Northeast, mostly because we've lost these cold temperatures. These really cold temperatures kind of knock them back, and I'll summarize that a little later. But again, these were all surprises. Like we thought with climate, it was just we're going to have hotter, longer summers, but really the change has been most dramatic in the winter. When we do a lot of work on snow, the other change has been ice on the lake. This is Mirror Lake at Hubbard Brook, and we've been tracking very carefully the ice cover on the lake, and the days of ice cover have been dropping at about half a day a year since the mid 60s. There's just, the ice either starts later or it melts earlier, and so the lakes just have less ice on them. The winter climate change has been a big surprise for us, and we've studied a lot. And again, we do science, and then we say, okay, how is this useful to people? How is this important to people? And so we have an extensive program of outreach where we spend a lot of time engaging with people who ski, native, indigenous peoples, foresters, wildlife people. We know that our winter is changing. How is it affecting people? So we spend a lot of time engaging with different stakeholder groups. Here's the science that here are the results we find in our science. What do you observe in your observations? And what are we going to do about it together? And the winter has, since it's been surprising and since it's so important to the economy in the Northeast, there's been lots of discussions. And so we've been working with stakeholders to engage with stakeholders and understand, we're losing cold days, we're losing snow, we're having a shorter cold period. And how does that affect things like outdoor recreation? How does it affect water quality and flooding? How does it affect public health with things like ticks, wildlife, cultural traditions, and the people's sense of place, and then the forest health and forest product industries? We talk in general about this, and then we get real specific. So this table is a little bit difficult to see, but we have synthesized our results to look at indicators that really matter to people. So the length of the winter, the coldest day of the year, the frost day, the extreme cold days, like how many days does it get cold enough to kill pine beetles, which are moving up from the south? How many days does it get cold enough to kill the hemlock woolly adelgid? How many snowmaking days before Christmas do you get? So this is huge for the ski operators in the area. They want to if your mountain is covered with snow over the Christmas holiday, you make a lot of money. And so we've been tracking the number of snowmaking days where you could possibly make snow. And that's gone down. You can see that's gone down by about 15 days in parts of the upper Midwest. This is a comparison between the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast. but there's about 16 days less of snowmaking days before Christmas, which is a problem. We've got invasive mosquitoes. The number of days where it gets cold enough to kill the Asian tiger mosquito, they have disappeared. And so the winter work at Hubbard Brook, it's a lot of nerdy, detailed, basic science, but it's of interest to people. And we've spent a lot of time engaging with people to try and make the data useful to people in a way that I think we're proud of. Okay, then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the changing biota. And I'll just give one example. We track lots of biota at Hubbard Brook. And in particular, we track insects. You can see this is insects going back to the 60s. You can see there's been a decline in insects. There's concern about the insect apocalypse going on across the planet. We have a lot of data at Hubbard Brook on that. We've tracked birds since the 60s. The number of birds was dropping very rapidly for a long time. Now it seems to be coming back. Kind of another surprising result. And so we've tracked salamanders and beetles, big declines in those since the 70s. So we track these biotic changes. But the one I just wanted to focus on was the one that's coming now, is the emerald ash borer, which we discovered found at Hubbard Brook, I guess last year or the year before. And we're way out in front of this. So we estimate there's about 26,000 big ash trees at Hubbard Brook, and they're going to die in the next 5 years or so. And this is going to have a huge effect on the forest. So we've established an experiment to treat half the stands so that the ash don't die, and we're going to compare them with untreated stands. And because we have a long-term study, it's giving us this opportunity to really get an experiment up to understand how this change in the forest is going to affect many aspects of the forest. And then just to reiterate, we do science, but we're really interested in the broader impacts of science, and this whole and that's partially it's making sure that our information is relevant to stakeholders. But we're really interested. It's a great place to work at Hubbard Brook, and so we're really interested in recruiting and training the next generation of scientists. And certainly the theme at the Museum of the White Mountains is to integrate art and science as a tool for increasing understanding and engaging people in science. And we're really keen, this is across science, and Hubbard Brook is in the lead on this, in increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in science. So we've been bringing new kinds of people to the woods and trying to diversify our students and our scientists. And it's a famous research place. We've been there for a long time. We have some real opportunities to train scientists and to diversify the scientific workforce, which will pay really huge dividends for our society in the long term. Okay, and so my parting thoughts. I think, again, I'm the luckiest scientist in the world because I get to work at Hubbard Brook, and the work at Hubbard Brook, we learn a lot about the forests in New Hampshire, but as you can see, we're in constant network with other people working in forests across the world, and so we're always thinking about how does the things that we learn at Hubbard Brook, what do they tell us about forests across the world? The real message from Hubbard Brook is that there are some things you can do with long-term research that you just can't learn other ways. And Hubbard Brook is the longest long-term research sites in the U.S. And it continues to provide insights. We continue to have surprising results that emerge from the long-term data, and require further long-term data to test. And so the really unique thing about Hubbard Brook, and the message from Hubbard Brook, is that there's a need for long-term studies. And then the other is the idea of broader impacts. I think because we're a long-term site with lots of people, we have the opportunity to really work that interface between science and society, whether it's by talking with artists or by engaging with stakeholders or bringing new people into the woods. We have the opportunity to transform the way science is done and the way science is used, and ultimately that's just as important as the new things that we learn in science. And that's all I wanted to say. And so if there are questions, I see let's see if there are any questions. Yeah, so
go ahead.
I see some questions in the chat. Oh, good. I got some questions in the chat. Yeah, so I can go through these questions I can go through this. So there's a question about working with arborists or other sanctuaries for plants to sequester threatened species, and so this is something we have not been doing at Hubbard Brook, but it's very exciting. This idea of and in the Park Service and other conservation scientists have said, should we be doing species translocations, where should we be moving species around to facilitate their adaptation to climate change? And it's a very exciting question. What we're doing though at Hubbard Brook is studying, because we have a long-term site, studying just how fast the species are changing. So if you think about it, at Hubbard Brook, we know that it's getting warmer, so we're expecting our tree species to change. And in particular, we're on the lookout for white pine and oak. Right, so our forest, it's maple, beech, spruce, birch, but because we're out there looking at the vegetation all the time, we see a bunch of pines and oaks, especially at the southern end of the valley where they're most susceptible to come. So we are tracking what species are coming and the rate of change of those species that are coming, and that is super important, fundamental information for any efforts to do assisted migration. So we're not doing it at Hubbard Brook, but we're certainly interested in it and trying to do some of the science that could help. So the next question, this is a question that I love about. So, okay, so the nitrogen reduction, if you look at that tree ring, it seems to start around 1920. And 1920, we would argue, is right around when climate change started to take hold, right? In a way that maybe we didn't see it in the atmospheric record. Like, no one really started measuring the increase in atmospheric CO2 until the 50s in Hawaii. But you could argue is that by 1920, we had put a bunch of extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The world was getting warmer and starting to get greener. And so we think that it was used to it was partially this we're starting to see the effects of climate change. A lot of people have talked about the idea that it was a recovery from previous disturbance, so this change in land use in the Hubbard Brook Valley, and that also could be playing a role, is that this is a regrowing forest that by 1920 was just getting pretty big, and maybe that's why the nitrogen shortage started to show up there. So it's a very good question, and we need more of these isotope studies to do it. Yeah, so different question about the differences in the climate impacts between the Northeast and the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes have a huge effect on the climate. They're in a much different, aside from the fact that the lakes modify the climate, but they're in the middle of the continent, and so the mid-continental climate is much more variable. They get these cold fronts, and then they get the warm fronts, and so the climate change has definitely played out somewhat different in those different regions. But for the most part, they're seeing the same things we are. They're seeing longer, warmer summers. They're seeing big changes in the winter. Some of the extremes are different, but the basic pattern is the same. And they're different. The lakes have an effect, but then also their location in the mid-continent has a big effect. Right. So here's this question about, have we seen an increase in forest biomass production due to increasing CO2 levels? Yes. And the U.S. Forest Service runs this program called Forest Inventory and Assessment. They sample thousands of plots across the country. And so people think, hey, if it's warmer, if it's wetter, if there's more CO2 in the air, trees ought to be growing like crazy. And sure enough, the trees are growing like crazy, except where they're not. And in many places, the trees are dying because of these pests. So in most places, the new climate and the new chemistry is making the trees grow better. But let's take our hemlocks in the Northeast. They're just flat out dying because they've got the hemlock woolly adelgid. And so it varies a lot from species to species. We see in the Northeast red spruce, which we would expect to be kind of dying because it's a northern species, is just doing great because it likes the warm weather and it really likes the reduction in acidity. But then some of our other species like beech, there's a beech bark disease, so the beech are not doing that well. Sugar maple are sometimes are doing well, sometimes they're not. But for the most part, yep, if it's warmer and if it's wetter and if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, then trees grow better. They like it. But the ecology is complicated, and these diseases and these insects are the thing that are going to get us. a wonderful comment from June Fichter, clearly a discerning individual there. Oh yeah, and so and so here's this introducing disease-resistant American chestnuts in the area. We have not, but I work in forests in New York City, and I work in forests in the Hudson Valley in New York, and there are people who are introducing disease-resistant chestnuts and elm, which is another thing that we lost. I don't know, maybe you all know, but I don't think there was a lot of chestnut at Hubbard Brook. It's I think we were too far north for chestnut. You see it. You go into this part of New York where I'm sitting, or you go into like the Appalachian Mountains, and there hemlock was 40% of the basal area, and then all those trees died. I don't think that there was chestnut at Hubbard Brook, and so but of course it raises the question of, we have a new climate now, so maybe chestnut would do great at Hubbard Brook, and the just like the assisted migration, the temptation to actively mitigate some of the disasters that have happened is overwhelming. We're not doing a lot of that. The Forest Service, which actively manages forests much more so than us, and we're doing the science that underlies that, and that's why it's kind of fun at Hubbard Brook. We have we meet with people with the scientists in the Forest Service, but also the managers in the White Mountain National Forest, and they'll come to us. They'll say, "Could you figure this out for us?" And, yeah, well, give me time, and we'll figure it out. So it's a nice interaction. All right, other questions out there? So Becky Moore definitely needs to go get a PhD, because this is a really great question. I don't know, you might even have a PhD already. I do not know, but this question of land use and the plants that the effects of land use on current vegetation are very profound, and so at Hubbard Brook itself, the land use history is relatively straightforward in that there was very little evidence, there was very little agriculture in the area, but in other parts of the White Mountains where there was agriculture, you see that legacy in the soil, and you see it in the vegetation, because it's just you change the soil. It takes a long time for the soil to recover. The soil influences what vegetation grows. And the really good natural historians can walk across the landscape and they say, "Oh yeah, this was grazed by sheep. This was grazed by cows. This was plowed," because you can see it. You can read the vegetation. It's kind of fun. Everywhere. There's a question about where else we can track these observations. So one of the things that's nice about, and I think this is a huge culture of science advance. Now, all our data are publicly available. So you can go to the Hubbard Brook website, and all our data sets are publicly available with very detailed what we call metadata, which describes the data. And you can see I showed a graph of temperature from Mount Washington and from Pinkham Notch and from Hubbard Brook. And there's a real evidence. We have a climate communication committee, which is trying to assemble long-term data in the region in a format that's accessible to people. I think there's a nice exhibit about this up at the White Mountain National Observatory, or you're at Mount Washington Observatory. So there's a lot of interest in the data are publicly available, but there's a lot of interest in making them available in a way that's easier for people.
Is that chart available that compares Mount Washington and
yeah,
the forest?
It is, and I have to, I was able to come up with that graph really easy, but I think if you and I could track it down, but if you went to the Mount Washington Observatory website, they're really good at. I mean, they're much more focused on public interface, and so all their data are there.
I did, and that was the question I had, but you answered it, that with that little the both charts together, and because I'm writing a book about Franconia Notch, and I like to include that both locations in the different elevations that show the temperature rise.
So if you at Hubbard Brook, we measure the temperature rise at the bottom of the hill and the top of the hill. It's colder at the top of the hill than the bottom of the hill, and so anyway, if you can't find what you need, send me an email, and I'll be glad to hook you up to some people that are doing this.
That's great. How about do you encourage people to come in and visit the forest?
Yeah, so the forest, we like to say Hubbard Brook is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. It is owned by the people of the United States of America, and so it's open for anyone to use. It's not the most spectacular spot in the White Mountains. It's not even Welsh Dicky Mountain. Like I don't know if you all do the Welsh Mountain Dicky Mountain Trail, which to me is just a spectacular short trail. Hubbard Brook, it's just woods, and that's good and it's bad, right? So it's bad, and then it's not. You don't get spectacular views, but if you want a quiet walk in the woods, Hubbard Brook is a great spot for it. And so Hubbard Brook is open to the public for people drive, people ski, people snowmobile, people hike, people camp. Since it's an experimental watershed that they don't advertise it as a place to go, but it's certainly open to people. And I like walking in there because I'm just quiet walk in the woods. It's kind of hard to come by sometimes.
I'm going to check it out this spring.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful road, and there's a new beaver dam along the main Hubbard, which is kind of impressive. So it's yes. So Robert put in hubbardbrook.org, which is I'm clicking on. That should take us to our most recent website. My computer is kind of choking on it. Come on. But yep, that takes you to the Hubbard Brook ecosystem study, and you can see all our data are there, and there's lots of descriptions about the site. That would be the place to go.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your time tonight and all this great information about the amazing research that you can do if you take enough time and have the right unit of study. So thank you again, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. All good night.